What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be talking about the new and improved, or I shouldn't say improved, but the new damage mitigation formula as of Dragonhold. This video is actually a patch late. It's actually suspected that the damage mitigation formula changed in Scalebreaker during the PTS cycle there, and I just didn't bother to update the damage mitigation video that I currently have. There were some tests that had to go on to kind of see exactly how things were playing out. But Paul Simon PS on the official forums did the test, and a couple of others kind of confirmed his findings more or less. It's still a little bit murky exactly how it's all interacting, but we have a very good idea of how it's all playing out right now. So apologies for the delay behind this video, but here it is, the new damage mitigation formula. So at this point now, there have been 3 changes to the damage mitigation formula, I should say. The first one was prior to Murkmire. So prior to Murkmire, your shields did not inherit any of your resistances, so the damage mitigation formula is given as here. After Murkmire was released, now your shields do gain your additional mitigation. So now your shields inherit your resistances. So if you have, let's say, 15,000 resistances and you cast a shield, your shield also has 15,000 resistances. Now in Scalebreaker, we have a new mitigation formula, and this seems pretty insane, but so I'll break it down for you guys pretty simply. So more or less, resistances have remained the same. So your resistance cap, hard cap, is still 33,000 in PvE content. Once you hit above 33,000, you're not going to mitigate any more damage, so that is capped out at 50% when you hit 33,000 resistances. In PvP, you can obviously go higher because players have penetration. And so you can go higher in order to account for that penetration, but for PvE, you're capped out at 33,000. Major Maim and Minor Maim are multiplicative with each other, and they are considered separate from any other sources of mitigation. Now, this is where things get a little weird. If you have any source of vulnerability, you have this term here, which basically takes your mitigation and basically subtracts out the vulnerabilities. So let's say you have minor vulnerability, and let's say you also have minor protection and major protection, or to say just minor protection. That 8% from minor protection, the 8% from minor vulnerability is subtracted out of that, so you're left with 0. Once there, your major protection then is multiplied on top of that. It's a little bit confusing, so I'll try to kind of reiterate it again. If you have any vulnerabilities present, they will be subtracted out of mitigation, any mitigation you have, so things like minor Aegis, minor protection, any other sources of mitigation like CPs. Your vulnerabilities will be taken out of that pool first, and anything that is remaining will be multiplicative on top of that. So again, I gave you the example of having minor vulnerability, minor protection, and major protection. The minor protection and the minor vulnerability will cancel out. That's 8% each, so 8 minus 8 is 0. So you're getting basically, you're canceling those 2 out, but you're still getting that major protection, but that is multiplicative with the minor Maim and the major Maim and your resistances as well. All of that, so your shields are still affected by resistances, so you still have resistances on your shield. And then the second big change was that block mitigation is now additive, and the total block mitigation has been capped at 90% mitigation, and that was because of a couple of changes that basically increased the block mitigation up, so you can get over 100% block mitigation, so you basically take no damage. They did change that once that exploit was found on the PTS. So now block mitigation is additive, and you can only get up to 90% total block mitigation, so that includes the 50% from block, so this times that will max out at 90% mitigation. The rest of this is pretty much how it remains from the previous video. We'll still go over it, but it will be fairly brief. But essentially what happens is multiplicativity and additivity are 2 different ways of calculating things out. Generally speaking, multiplicative is going to give you a different answer, a different result compared to additive. And the best way to kind of see this is basically, if you take a value, let's say you have 0.5 and 0.2. If you take them additively, basically you add them together, you get 0.7. But if you take them multiplicatively against each other, do the math real quick up here, you actually end up getting a value of, let's see, so it would be 1 minus this. You would get that value, but if they were additive, actually, hold on. So if they were, sorry. So if they were additive, you would have something that looks like this, plus 0.2. So that you would get a mitigation of 0.3. But if they're multiplicative with each other, then you would have two terms. You would have this value, take that, then you would multiply this out by the 1 minus 0.2. You get 0.45 instead. So in this instance, the multiplicative basically makes it a little bit less effective in terms of mitigation. For damage, multiplicativity is generally better because you get higher values, the 0.45 compared to 0.3. But for mitigation, multiplicative modifiers basically kind of reduces the overall mitigation. So next we'll go over the different sources of mitigation. So you have all these different sources of shields. The shields have been buffed. So the light armor shield and the sword shield, they've been buffed by 10%. So before it was 40%, 60% for harness magic and depth magic. Now it's 50-60. Same thing for empowered ward and hardened ward. Now it's 50-60. A few other changes to a couple of shields here, but not anything that's too big. The big things are the bone shield has been dropped down to 25% of your max health. Approximately, absorb magic is approximately 25% of your max health now. So damage shields, not much has changed here. Any sort of mitigation, these are the values that we're using here. So major Maim and minor Maim, because they are kind of separated out, you can pretty much take them as 0.7 and 0.85. But for everything else, because you will take out vulnerabilities out of these, you will have to use the actual value itself. So major protection, for example, is 30% damage reduced, so you will have to take 0.3, and so on and so forth for everything. And that's because we're subtracting out the vulnerabilities if they're present. So you're going to have to take the actual percentage value rather than 1 minus the percentage value because of the equation up here, where we already have that 1 minus there. Then we have block mitigation. Again, these can only stack up to 0.9. And then you have some sources of vulnerability. In PvE, you will only really be affected by two sources. It's either going to be minor vulnerability, which is possible to get have it proc on you whenever you take shock damage. And then if you're a vampire or a werewolf, you will take damage from flame or poison, depending on your stage or if you're transformed, respectively, for the vampire and the werewolf. So those are pretty much the only two sources of vulnerability in PvE. Obviously, in PvP, you might have some more sources, particularly major vulnerability from any necromancers that you are fighting against. But a couple of examples here, just to give you an idea of how this all plays out. Base hits in PvE can actually be very, very high. It's not uncommon to see a base hit of around like 200k or so on like a boss's heavy attack. Even some certain bosses' light attacks can get up to 6 figures with base hits. But let's say we're a tank, we max out our resistances, we're blocking, we have a couple of, let's see, what do we have here? We're on a DK, so we have the additional 20% from the sword and shield passive. We have additional 10% as a DK. We have a shield with Igneous Shield. We have Maim active, and then we also have Protection, Hardy, and Ironclad. Because we don't have any vulnerability active, we can take all of these as multiplicative with each other. And so that's this value here. Notice that we have 1 minus Hardy times 1 minus Protection. You'll see this why this is important when we go into the minor vulnerability one in 4.4. And so with a base hit of 150k, if we're blocking as a tank using these sort of assumptions here, we're only taking about 10k damage or so. Now, if we miss the block, we don't have the block mitigation anymore, we end up taking 28.7k. Big hit, but still survivable as a tank. Let's say it's on a DPS now. Let's say it's a magic DPS. We have max health of 20k. We have damp magic, so we have 60% max health shield. And then we only have 15,000 resistances, which is not unthinkable as a magic DPS. By that, we're also blocking as well, but we have no additional block mitigation outside of the 50%. So we're just gonna die because we take more than our health. We take 31,000 damage. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky. Now we have minor vulnerability. Now the math here is pretty simple because we have minor protection, so those just cancel out like the example I gave earlier in the video. But This is basically how it plays out. So we have protection and vulnerability. So basically we subtract these out. So this gives us 0. So this is just multiplied by 1. So this entire term essentially gets canceled out. And then we get the hardy ironclad after that. So if we had the minor vulnerability, instead of the 10,056, we take 10,383. Not a big increase overall. And for the DPS, instead of 31.4, we're taking 35.4 instead. So essentially, it's still a one shot for the DPS, so it really doesn't make that big of a difference, even though it's about a 4k actual damage difference. For tanks, because you have so much mitigation, you won't really notice it if you have minor vulnerability. So that's a little bit of an advantage for you there. Now, it is possible to calculate out the highest base damage that a DPS can take based on a couple of assumptions that you make here. This is basically how it all plays out. This is just a lot of different algebra taking place here. So instead of damage taken, you replace that with your max health. You divide out by your block mitigation, so this entire term here. Then you add your shields. So you have this entire term plus your shield, then you divide by the mitigation again. Then you can pretty much use anything that you have here, and then just calculate out your base damage. So if we work backwards for your typical magic DPS, the maximum base hit that'll kill us, assuming that we have Ironclad and Hardy and we're blocking and all things like that, is about 121k. So anything above this is going to be a one-shot while we're blocking. Anything below this, we can survive if we're blocking. So how does this compare prior to Scalebreaker? We will end up taking a little bit more damage. It's not actually all that much damage. So as a DPS, this is the new formula. So this is if we have the vulnerability active. So this is being taken out of Ironclad. Notice here that even though we have Ironclad and vulnerability, this doesn't end up being 1 because the Ironclad that we're assuming is greater than the vulnerability that we're taking out. So we still get a net positive when it comes to the amount of mitigation that we're getting. So this entire value here is no longer completely reduced down to 1. So it's still there, it's just not as effective as it could have been. So the new formula, we're taking 35,000.4 from above. The old formula had vulnerability being multiplied after all the mitigation. So again, multiplicativity means we're taking a little bit less damage. So the old formula, we were taking just under 34k. So we're taking about 1k more damage as a DPS. Again, still going to be a one shot, so you're not really going to notice that big of a difference. As a tank, not that big of a difference here. So 10.4k from above. The old formula where we had vulnerability be multiplicative with everything ends up being 10.2k instead. So we're not seeing that big a difference. We're only seeing a total of 145 extra damage as a tank based on these new changes. And again, for DPS, because a lot of the base hits now are very, very high, it's still going to be a one shot no matter what. So you're still taking more damage. There are probably going to be very, very few instances where what was not a one-shot prior to Scalebreaker is now a one-shot. So not that big of a change for DPS or tanks, but it is still a change nonetheless. So still important to document here. And then critical resistances, for those of you guys who are interested in PvP, as far as I know, that is not changed at all. So the crit modifier and all that stuff is still there. So crit resistances is divided by 68 and divided by 100. So for example, if you have crit resistance of 2000, you can reduce the crit modifier that anybody who crits on you by 29.4%. So you would be able to reduce that down. So let's say they have a crit modifier of 1.5, they have major force, somebody used a warhorn, so it's 1.65. You can reduce this down by 0.294, so that'll give you a little bit more survivability. The crits will be a little bit reduced that way. But that pretty much covers it for damage mitigation. Again, generally speaking, not that big of a change for DPS or tanks. You are taking a little bit more damage when vulnerabilities are applied, but it's not really going to make that big of a difference to your overall survivability. But that concludes this video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. Let me know down in the comment section below if you guys have any questions, and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.